From the Black Templars to the Ancestral Kin, it's time to take a look at the Leagues of Votann index, and as before, go through their tome unit by unit and rule by rule to get a better idea of how they play, what is strong, and what tricks they have up their admittedly quite short sleeves. Being the newest army on the 40k block, the Leagues of Votann came in obscenely strong in 9th edition to the extent that they got a nerf before even being officially released. 10th edition has been less kind to them, with a fair few struggles in the early days. They have had a few points adjustments as well as rules updates since then, which have definitely helped to make the most of their relatively small and limited roster, and their main army rule certainly helps now with the reliability of your damage output, thanks to their rule which is called Eyes of the Ancestors. Now, the Eye of the Ancestors is a rule which lets you, whenever a friendly unit is destroyed by an enemy unit, put a judgment token onto that enemy unit, and each enemy unit can have up to 2 judgment tokens, and then whenever a unit from your army attacks an enemy unit which has a judgment token on, you get a boost to your attacks. So if the enemy unit has 1 judgment token, you get +1 to hit rolls, and if it has 2 judgment tokens, you also get +1 to the wound roll. What that means essentially is if an enemy unit has caused you some pain and killed off a couple of your units, you can get your revenge much more easily by gaining potentially +1 to hit and +1 to wound on your attacks into them, which does really mean you want a few small min-sized units to act as almost sacrificial lambs to help you rack up those judgment tokens, but also some bigger, heavier hitting squads to really leverage the most out of those bonuses to hit and to wound. Now, the big downside is, of course, it does mean your stuff has to die before you get a benefit, but in 40k, even in 10th edition, stuff is always going to die. There is no avoiding that. So just getting a nice way to actually benefit from it is quite nice, and the 2 buffs you can get, +1 to hit and +1 to wound, are fairly solid buffs in their own right, especially +1 to wound. That is quite rare. So I do like this army rule. It can take a little while to really get rolling, but it does mean that as the game progresses and you get into the middle and end game, your attacks can be much more impactful than your base datasheets may indicate. And your ability to leverage these buffs from the get-go can be made a bit easier as well with your detachment rule, and this is called Ruthless Efficiency. And this has had a few changes since 10th edition originally dropped. It now lets you at the start of the battle pick a number of units depending on the game size, and they start with 2 judgment tokens. So immediately you can pick the scariest enemy units and just be shooting into them with +1 to hit and +1 to wound straight from turn 1. Now you get to pick 2 units in an incursion size game, 4 in a strike force, and a whopping 6 in an onslaught size game. So you really will get an opportunity to pick the biggest and most important Death Stars or linchpin units that your opponent has to try and take them out or neutralize them as soon as possible. And then on top of that, you also get bonus command points when you've destroyed those chosen units. So if any of the chosen units have been destroyed by the start of your first or second command phases, you get a massive 3 command points, down to 2 if they're destroyed by the 3rd or 4th, and then just a bonus 1 command point if it's by your 5th command phase. So really incentivizing you to focus down and kill those specific units as soon as possible, and giving you potentially a huge impact on not only your army's efficiency, but, you know, on the enemy game plan, thanks to killing off their big scary units, as well as giving you those resources in those 1 or 2 or 3 command points to help you get the most out of your stratagems. So it really is quite a powerful detachment rule, and it's really quite flexible as well, because obviously you get to choose which units you're going to go after, so you can really focus down the things that you know are going to be the biggest threat to you. Of course, the leagues get their list of 6 stratagems to help boost their abilities even more, with a nice little mix of offensive and defensive things to use. First up, we have Warrior's Pride. This is a 1 command point strat used in the fight phase, and it lets you pick a friendly unit and an enemy unit with a judgment token that is in engagement range of your unit, and then you can, until the end of the phase, improve the AP of your melee attacks by 1 when you're fighting into them. So getting around things like Armor of Contempt, or just leveraging that little bit more into an enemy to try and kill them off on top of the potential +1 to hit and wound you might be getting. So this can combo into quite a scary prospect for your opponent. You also get Ancestral Sentence, which is in your shooting phase and is again 1 command point. This time though, you pick a friendly unit, and until the end of the phase, you get sustained hits 1 on the attacks, and if you are shooting at an enemy unit with a judgment token on, you get sustained hits 2. Now this can be monstrously good with some of your shooting. Getting essentially 3 hits on a hit roll of a 6 can make some of your attacks really, really scary and let you put a huge dent into anything from hordes of gaunts to Imperial Knights equally as effectively. On the movement front, you can make use of Ordered Retreat, which lets you choose a unit in your army which has fallen back and they can still attempt to shoot and charge. So if you get tied up in melee, you can very easily just pull back, unleash a load of damaging shots into the opponent, and then either charge back into them or just try and scoot round them to potentially charge a unit they were trying to protect or screen. So this is really good on an army like the Votann, which do have a few slower moving units that you do want to get into melee. So being able to more easily dictate those combats and get into them that much more reliably is a very, very powerful tool to have. Reactive Reprisals is in the enemy shooting phase. This one is 2 command points, but you use it after an enemy unit has shot at you, and if that enemy unit had any judgment tokens on it, you can pick a friendly unit that was the target of their shooting attacks, and they can shoot back at the enemy. So if they didn't manage to kill you off, you can again get your revenge and return fire, potentially doing even more damage into them than they did into you. There is no -1 to hit on these attacks or anything like that. It is essentially just a free shooting phase for that unit, albeit at the cost of 2 command points. But this could easily let you kill off an injured monster or vehicle or a few models from an enemy unit. So it is really strong and definitely, I think, worth keeping 2 command points in your pocket for when you do need it. The last 2 are again 1 command point, and up first is Newfound Nemesis. This one helps with your judgment token generation. It's in the opponent's shooting or fight phase after an enemy unit has resolved their attacks, and what it does is that when an infantry or mounted unit from your army is reduced to below half strength as a result of those attacks, the enemy unit that attacked you gets a judgment token, or 2 judgment tokens if that unit had your warlord in. So even if they don't end up killing your unit, you can still punish them with a few judgment tokens to help you then hit back into them even harder with the potential +1 to hit or +1 to wound as well. And then finally, you have Void Armor. This is a solid Armor of Contempt style defensive. For 1 command point, you can use it in the enemy shooting or fight phase. You pick a friendly unit that has been chosen as the target, and the enemy unit worsens the AP of their attacks by 1. So just making your armor go that bit further, and it really can help you, alongside cover, make it much harder for your opponent to push those wounds through into you. So it's not particularly complicated as a strat, but it's very effective, and like Armor of Contempt, you will probably be using it quite a lot as the game goes on. There are, of course, 4 enhancements to pick from as well, and like other armies, you can pick up to 3 of these for the appropriate points cost, of course. And we start with Appraising Glare. This one is 20 points, and it lets you, in your command phase, pick an objective marker that your opponent controls, and until your next command phase, if an enemy unit is within range of the marker, it counts as having 1 more judgment token. So 1 if it had 0, or 2 if it had 1. So it's a great way to get you that +1 to wound buff if you've already got 1 judgment token on them, or just get you that simpler +1 to hit if you really do need to try and push an enemy unit off an objective. Grim Demeanor is next. It's also 20 points. This one lets you the ability to re-roll battle shock tests for the bearer and his unit, and also lets you ignore characteristics modifiers, excluding saving throws of course, but for anything that impacts your movement or objective control or things like that, this can make your units a bit more reliable. It's useful, don't get me wrong, but it's probably not one of the best, I don't think, and I don't know if I think we'll see it all that much for that 20-point cost. A long list is up next. This is the cheapest at 15 points, but it does give you a solid bonus. Whenever the bearer or his unit destroys an enemy unit, if that unit had a judgment token, you can pick another enemy unit visible to the bearer and that unit gains a judgment token. So it's a really brilliant way to let you keep those judgment tokens rolling and jumping around the enemy army without having to have your own units destroyed to build them back up again. So I do quite like this one. I think it can be well worth taking for 15 points just to get a couple of judgment tokens and keep them being spread around the enemy army as the battle rages on. And then finally, we have the 25-point Wayfarer's Grace. This is the most expensive enhancement, but it lets you roll a dice after the bearer is destroyed, and on a 2+, you can bring the model back as close as possible to where it was destroyed and outside of engagement range of the enemy with full wounds. This can be incredible if your unit was killed in the enemy fight phase, as it will set you up for a brilliant next turn. It can somewhat backfire if the enemy killed you in their shooting phase, because you might just bring back your warlord and then they'll just die in a follow-up charge. But it is still very, very good, and I think for 25 points, having a key linchpin hero back to help provide some buffs and bonuses to your forces could be brilliantly useful. And I think in general, the Appraising Glare and a long list are two I would bring the most often, but Wayfarer's Grace is definitely worth considering. But those two, I think Appraising Glare and a long list, you will see in most armies and most games, because they bring a load of bonuses that really will help the rest of your army perform as good as possible. On the unit front, we begin with the named hero Ûthar the Destined. The Votann infantry are a tad slower than average with only a 5-inch move, but they are decently durable, and Ûthar is toughness 5 with 5 wounds and a fairly decent 3-up save and 4-up invuln to keep him alive. He also gets some even more potent survivability thanks to some of his abilities. The Destined in particular is fantastic, as it means that each attack allocated to him is reduced to damage 1. So all of those 2 or 3 damage attacks get dropped by half or more, and even the scariest of things like Imperial Knights with their 6 or 8 damage swings will also now only be doing 1 damage to him, which is just incredible, and it means that low volume, super high damage attacks are just really, really awful into him. He can also change a hit or wound roll into an unmodified 6 once per turn thanks to Ancestral Fortune, which is great for boosting his reliability, but also keys in quite nicely thanks to both of his weapons having devastating wounds. So that unmodified 6 can be made to go even further, especially in melee with his sword. His final ability is Grim Efficiency. This is once per battle round, but it lets you in your command phase pick an enemy unit visible to him and it gains a judgment token. So once more, just a really solid way to begin building up those judgment tokens on an enemy, even if nothing has died yet. He also gets a War Gear ability in his Rampart Crest, which is a great force multiplier for a unit he joins, which can be either the Hearthkyn Warriors or the Einhyr Hearthguard, and he gives them a 5-up invulnerable save, so just making their durability go that bit further as well. In terms of his own damage output, he's not too shabby. His ranged is a Vulcanite Destructor, which is 3 shots at 18 inches. They hit on 2s at strength 5, no AP and just 1 damage, but they do have those devastating wounds, so he can spike it and do a bit more damage if you're lucky. His real output though is the Blade of Ancestors. This is 5 attacks, again 2s to hit, but much better being strength 6 minus 3 AP and 2 damage, again with devastating wounds. So it's really quite good at killing Marines, and he puts down just over 2 Marines by himself, and also being able to guarantee those devastating wounds when you need them just makes him that much more useful. I think whilst he's not the killiest or choppiest character, he does bring a lot for what you pay, which is just 80 points. So he can be worth bringing because he can also be quite a bit of a roadblock thanks to that reduced damage ability he has. If your opponent has a big scary character or monster, they are going to just feel really anemic into him. But what might be slightly better in terms of an option is the slightly cheaper regular non-named Kâhl, who is a little bit cheaper at just 70 points, but more importantly, he can be a bit more customizable than Ûthar. So the regular Kâhl, he's still toughness 5 with a 3-up save and a 4-up invuln. He's only got 4 wounds, and again, he can join the Hearthguard or the Hearthkyn warriors. In terms of his abilities, he still has the Grim Efficiency rule, which lets you start to spread those judgment tokens around like Ûthar, but he on top of that brings a slightly more overt buff to his unit with Kindred Hero. And this is a very simple one. It grants lethal hits to him and the unit he joins, so it makes it that much easier for even things like your standard bolters that your warriors have to be more reliable into tougher enemies. In terms of his options, he's got 2 war gear options. He's got the Rampart Crest and the Teleport Crest. The Rampart Crest, like Ûthar, grants models in his unit a 5-up invuln, whilst the Teleport Crest, as you might expect, gives his unit Deep Strike, so either making him and his squad more durable at holding a backfield objective, or more mobile if you want them up the board advancing deeper into enemy territory and stealing your opponent's objectives. He also gets a few choices in terms of his weapons, the Autok Pattern Combi Bolter or the Vulcanite Disintegrator. So this is going to let you choose between either 3 strength 5 shots with devastating wounds or 4 strength 4 shots but also an extra 6 inches of range. And then on the melee front, his Plasma Axe gets you 4 attacks at strength 5, minus 2 AP and 2 damage, which hit on 2s, or you can take the Mass Gauntlet, which is better into tougher enemies. It's 3 attacks at strength 8, minus 2 AP and a flat 3 damage. Now it does only hit on 3s, and obviously the flat 3 damage is wasted on things like Marines, but strength 8 does mean wounding on 2s, which is really great, and with enough judgment tokens, the Mass Gauntlet can still be potentially hitting on 2s and wounding even tougher things like tanks and monsters on 3s, so it kind of depends what you're going into, but I think either option can be worthwhile, whether you want him as a anti-marine or more of an anti-elite, anti-light vehicle kind of killer. If you want something which is more purely melee focused, then the Einhyr Champion is a cheaper still 60 point pick. This guy is toughness 6, which is very helpful with his 2-up save and 5 wounds. He's got no invuln, but like the other heroes, he's got a choice of war gear, the Teleport Crest getting you Deep Strike for him and his unit, whilst the Weave Field Crest gives him a 4-up invuln, but it doesn't spread it to his squad. In terms of his rules, he and his unit get to reroll charges thanks to Exemplar of the Einhyr, which really does make him and something like a unit of Hearthguard really quite reliable at getting into combat despite their slower speed. And then he's got a very tasty impact hit style ability with mass driver accelerators, which means that whenever you finish a charge move, you can pick an enemy unit in engagement range and roll a dice. On a 2 to 5, they take D3 mortal wounds, whilst on a flat 6, they take D3 plus 3, potentially doing up to 6 damage to an enemy before the combat has even begun, which is really quite scary. And then he follows that up with either 6 attacks from his Dark Star Axe, which hit on 2s at strength 6, minus 2 AP and 2 damage, or again the more anti-elite, anti-vehicle, anti-monster option of the Mass Hammer. The Mass Hammer is only 3 attacks, and it does again only hit on 3s, but now it's strength 12, minus 2 AP, and it's D6 plus 1 damage, so it really is potentially quite powerful, and into something like an enemy Gladiator tank with 2 judgment tokens on, he can look to do around 6 damage into it, so on top of the impact hits, he could do roughly in the region of 8 to 9 damage to it, which would easily let a unit with him like your Hearthguard finish it off after him. So he is genuinely solid into tougher enemies or things like Marines with his axe if that's what you need him to take care of. And I think for just 60 points, he's also decently tanky for that price too. There is also some psychic shenanigans for the Votann. The Grimnyr is 65 points, but actually comes in the form of 3 models. The Grimnyr himself is toughness 5 with a 4-up save, 4 wounds, and a 4-up invuln, and his 2 corvs, which are his floating buddies, they are still toughness 5, but they're only 1 wound. The Grimnyr has some psychic powers. He brings his unit +1 toughness, so making the Hearthkyn warriors he can join a really nice toughness 6, which can go a long way against some armies, and then he can also once per battle make a unit automatically remove battle shock if it fails a test. So letting you essentially ignore battle shock once per game. Now this could come in handy if you really need to keep hold of an objective or just want to use a strat on them, but I think mainly it's the bonus to his unit's toughness that is really going to be the big thing that he brings to his squad. In terms of his damage output, he's got a Ward Stave, which gives him 1 attack at strength 7, -1 AP and D3 damage in melee, and then at range he can blast your opponent with Ancestral Wrath. This is either 3 shots that hit on 2s at strength 6, -2 AP and D3 damage, or he can focus it, which does make it hazardous, but it doubles the attacks going up to 6. So it's a solid boost to the output that it can do, and it could be worth it with that -2 AP and D3 damage. That can go quite a long way, but maybe not worth doing it if you are down to your last couple of wounds. On top of that, the Corvs add a bit more firepower with their Autok pattern bolters, giving you an extra 4 strength 4 shots. So it's not much, but making a unit of warriors toughness 6 and giving you some token battle shock protection for just 65 points, it isn't awful, and he is quite a cool model as well, so it's definitely one to consider if you wanted to add some of that psychic style output in a list of your Votann. Next up we have the Brôkhyr Ironmaster. He is likewise a character with a few buddies who come along with him. He is also 65 points, which nets you the same toughness 5, 4 wounds, and 4-up armor save, although no invuln this time. He can join the Hearthkyn warriors, or probably slightly fluffier, the Brôkhyr Thunderkyn, and he definitely does help them out quite a lot with his multi-spectral visor, which gives him and his unit +1 to hit with ranged attacks, so even against targets without a judgment token, he can get a lot of his attacks hitting on 2s, or make things like the Thunderkyn hit on 3s, which is really, really great. He comes alongside an Hernkyn assistant and also 3 ecogs. These guys help him heal up your units essentially. The Ironmaster has the Brôkhyr's Guild rule, which lets you heal a friendly vehicle or exoframe unit within 3 inches of him at the end of your movement phase, and they heal D3 lost wounds or a flat 3 if the Hernkyn assistant is still alive. So it's a really great way to keep some of your vehicles alive and trucking that little bit longer. And then you also get a range of output in terms of the damage. The Ironmaster himself has got a Graviton rifle for 3 strength 6 -1 AP 3 damage shots that wound vehicles on a 2+, which is really, really good. And then in melee, he is also great into vehicles. His Graviton hammer, it's 3 attacks. They only hit on 4s, but they're strength 9 -1 AP and 3 damage. And again, they wound vehicles on 2s. So he is really great into enemy tanks and that sort of thing. The assistant has a Las Beam Cutter, which is only 1 attack that hits on 4s, but it's strength 6 and -3 AP, which also isn't terrible, but it does only have a 6-inch range, so it is very much a danger close style weapon. And then lastly, his 3 ecogs, they've got more of a varied loadout. One of them gets a strength 4, 12-inch range Autok pattern bolt pistol. Another gets a plasma torch for strength 6 -3 AP, 2 damage in melee. And then the last one gets 3 strength 3, no AP, 1 damage swings from their manipulator arms. So it's nothing super, super scary. He is more of a healing unit that can add a bit more reliability to something like your Thunderkyn if he joins him, and can do a bit of token damage to enemy vehicles when you need him to. So that is probably where you're taking him if you bring him, with some Thunderkyn and near to some of your vehicles to heal them up, and just basically sending him after enemy tanks and the like that he can damage quite well. Moving on from the characters to the more generic units of the Votann, the Hearthkyn warriors are first, and they do have a really great set of options. They come in a unit of 10 for 100 points, so they are 10 points per model, which nets you a toughness 5 model with a 4-up save and 1 wound. So they're decently tough, but they're not super durable with 1 wound and a 4-up save. They can sometimes feel a bit squishier than you might expect, even with that toughness 5. But against a lot of light arms fire and bolter fire, they are actually going to feel quite good thanks to those only wounding you on 5s. They do get quite a cool rule in Luck Has, Need Keeps, and Toil Earns, which is basically a sticky objective style rule. At the end of your command phase, if this unit is within range of an objective, it stays in your control even if you move off. So really useful for taking an objective on your side of the board and then being able to head off to take the fight to the enemy and still be racking up those victory points. It's nothing super complicated, but it is always a very useful ability to have. They can also take a fairly good selection of war gear. 3 of the squad can take a pan spectral scanner, a comms array, and a medipack, granting the unit ignores cover, a 6-up feel no pain, and also a chance at a command point regen whenever you use a stratagem on them. So all of these are quite helpful as the battle goes on, keeping you alive a bit longer, boosting your range output on those battlefields with lots of cover in 10th edition, and then also potentially getting you an extra command point here and there. And then your Thane, who is the squad leader, they can also take a Weave Field Crest to get himself a 4-up invuln. Like the one earlier, it unfortunately doesn't buff the squad, but it does make him a bit more resilient against precision shooting. And then they can all swap their Autuk pattern bolters for an Iron Blaster. This drops 6 inches of range down to 18 inches, but you go to strength 5 and -2 AP instead of strength 4 and no AP. It does also lose a shot, so you do lose out on the weight of fire, but against Marines and that sort of thing, the strength 5 and the -2 AP can make an absolutely huge difference, and I would argue it's probably worth it if you know you are going into things that are toughness 4 or have, you know, a 3-up armor save and that kind of thing. You can then also take up to 2 of these special weapons, either a high las auto rifle, a high las rotary cannon, an L7 missile launcher, an Etacam plasma beamer, or a Magna rail rifle. The high las guns are mostly anti-infantry, with the auto rifle being 3 shots with rapid fire 2 and assault at strength 6 -1 AP and 1 damage, and the rotary cannon instead being heavy but with sustained hits 1, and it fires 6 shots at strength 6 -1 AP and 1 damage. If instead you want some more anti-armor, then the L7 missile launcher, that nets you a strength 9 -2 AP D6 damage shot, or D6 strength 4 no AP 1 damage shots with blast for anti-infantry, and then the pure anti-tank is the Magna rail rifle. This is only 1 shot that hits on 5s, although it is heavy so it can drop down to 4s, but then it is strength 12 -3 AP, D3 +3 damage, and it has devastating wounds. So it's very, very swingy, but potentially very, very devastating, and it can, if you get lucky, let you chunk huge damage out of enemy vehicles and monsters. The Plasma Beamer, conversely, is a bit more of an anti-elite choice. It's 1 shot, but it does have sustained hits D3, so you can be getting up to 4 hits with it, and it's strength 8 -3 AP 2 damage. So again, great into Marines and the like, cutting through most of their armor and insta-killing them with 2 damage. So it is really quite solid, and it's one of those guns that is good in various ways and good against a good variety of targets. But in general, the options you have for their heavy weapons are really going to depend on what you want the squad to be doing. You can equip them to be really good anti-tank, really good anti-horde, or a bit of a mixture really quite effectively. And for 100 points, it does get you a decently tanky, really versatile little unit. The Hearthguard are the Terminator equivalent for the Votann. They are toughness 6, 2 wounds and a 2-up save, and a unit of 5 to 10 for either 150 points or 320 points. So if you bring a full squad, you are looking at 32 points per model. They are very much a bodyguard unit, with their rule being Oathband Bodyguard, which means when a character is with the unit, the enemy has to subtract 1 from their wound rolls if the attack is a higher strength than the unit's toughness, so essentially making it so that they can never be wounded on better than a 3+, which is very, very helpful alongside their 2-up save. And then they can also, although they don't have 1 base, they can get an invuln if they are joined by something like a Kâhl with the Rampart Crest, which, as we saw earlier, grants them that 5-up invuln. The Hearthkyn, who is the unit sergeant, they can get a 4-up invuln because they can take a Weave Field Crest as we've seen earlier, or you can swap that out and give the unit Deep Strike with the Teleport Crest instead if you want to get them up the board faster. So they can be quite mobile or can just be really, really tanky, and their output, their damage output, can also be quite scary. All of them have got an Exo Armor Grenade Launcher for D6 shots at strength 4, no AP and 1 damage, so it doesn't seem like much, but with all of them firing alongside Blast, that can really add up and you can absolutely drown bigger enemy units just in weight of dice. And then further to that, you can take an Hearthkyn Plasma Gun for 1 strength 8, minus 3 AP, 2 damage shots at 24 inches, or if you want to bring some devastating wounds instead, they can each take a Vulcanite Disintegrator, which, like we saw earlier, it does cost you 6 inches of range and a good bit of strength, AP and damage, but it's 3 shots rather than 1, and it is devastating wounds. So if you want to try getting those 6s to wound, can potentially make up for it. But I think personally, the Plasma Gun is probably the better option just as a more generic all-rounder weapon. In melee, they all start with a Concussion Gauntlet for 2 strength 9, minus 2 AP, 2 damage attacks which hit on 3s, but they can instead get an extra attack each with a Plasma Blade Gauntlet instead. This is 3 attacks, but it's only strength 6, minus 2 AP and 1 damage, so it's generally a bit worse. But if you know you are going into things like Tau or Eldari or Guardsman, the Plasma Blade could be a much better pick. Also, with some extra options, the Hearthkyn, again, they can take some different things. They can instead take a Concussion Hammer, which nets him 3 attacks. They only hit on 4s, but it's strength 9, minus 1 AP and 3 damage, so it is a solid bit of damage into tougher enemies and could give your unit that bit of extra punch they need for when things like the Plasma Blades aren't going to be enough. I think in general, if you've got characters that you want to be protected, a unit of these is going to be almost mandatory. They are just overall a really durable anvil that also can be quite mobile if you kit them out the right way, and can have a good bit of punch when they do get into combat as well. So they are, as I said, basically like Terminators. They've just got 1 less wound, they are a bit tougher, and they have some slightly different weapon options. A more pure melee unit though is the Cthonian Beserks. They've got a much worse armor, and they are essentially the Votann equivalent of glass cannons. They are toughness 5 with 2 wounds, but they only have a 6-up save, so they are very, very squishy, even though they do have a fairly nice 5-up Feel No Pain to back them up. But at 20 points each, either in a unit or 5 or 10, they can hit very, very hard. In terms of their rules, they get a rule called Cyberstims, which means that when they are destroyed by a melee attack, they can fight before you remove them on a 4+, meaning that you get a 50-50 chance to punish the enemy if they fight and kill you before you get to fight in melee, which is really quite nice. And then Subterranean Explosives is a rule where in your shooting phase, after this unit has shot, you can pick a non-monster or vehicle unit that was hit by one of the attacks from the Mole Grenade Launcher they can take, and you roll a dice, and on a 4+, that enemy unit is shaken and has -2 to its movement, advance, and charge rolls. So you can really slow down a scary enemy melee threat to make it much easier for you to either avoid them or just set up and get the charge into them instead of them getting it into you. And when these guys do reach combat, they each have a heavy plasma axe which can be swapped for a concussion maul, and then 1 in 5 of them can have a twin concussion gauntlet. The plasma axe has a dual profile. It's either 3 attacks at strength 6 -2 AP and 2 damage, or 6 attacks at strength 4 -1 AP and 1 damage. So your unit of 5 for 100 points can kill around 7 marines if they have 2 judgment tokens on them, which is fairly good, all things considered. If instead you want to take the concussion maul, that only hits on 4s, but it's strength 9, -2 AP and 3 damage, so that means they're going to be great into things like Custodies or Terminators. And again, a unit of 10 with the concussion mauls at 200 points can kill over 8 Terminators or Custodian Guard in a single round if they have 2 judgment tokens on, which is just spectacularly good for their cost. They can absolutely trade up much, much better than you would think if they get into combat alive, and that's where the big issue is for them. They are so squishy that you need to get them into combat as soon as possible, because when they do get there, they will really make their points back. As mentioned, they do get a ranged option in the Mole Launcher, which 1 in 5 can have. It's D6 shots, they hit on 4s, but it is indirect fire, and it's strength 5, minus 1 AP, 1 damage. It's not going to generally do much, but the main use of it is to try and at least get 1 hit to trigger that subterranean explosives rule, just to slow your opponent down. And I think generally, if you are running a melee heavy army, these guys are a fantastic addition, either as a big threatening blob, or just a couple of smaller, scary distraction Carnifex style units running up the board towards the enemy, because your opponent really will not want these guys to get into combat, so they will have to really focus them down so that they don't reach the enemy lines and just start to rip things to shreds. If instead you want some mobility for your somewhat slow army, the Pioneers are going to be your go-to. They are a mounted unit, and they have a solid 12-inch move, as well as some boosted durability with toughness 6 and 3 wounds. They do still only have the 4-up save, but they are overall pretty tanky for their 30-point cost. You can bring them in either units of 3 or 6, so you can go min-sized or for a bigger Death Star style unit, and they also get a 9-inch scout move, which just adds to their mobility, and they are really going to be a great unit for your objective grabbing and also potentially your screening needs if you have certain units that you want protected. Their mobility and maneuverability is helped even further with their rule, which is called Outflanking Mag Riders. This lets you move them off the board and put them into strategic reserves at the end of the enemy turn if they are within 6 inches of a battlefield edge. Now, that can be really good for getting them around the board and getting them onto the other side of the board to go grab an objective, or just away from an enemy that is going to be a threat to them. So it is a really good mobility tool. And I think that's really important because they don't do melee well. They are really bad in melee. So you do want to avoid that wherever possible. But what they can do is put some reasonably okay shooting into the opponent, because they each come with a bolt shotgun and a Magna Coil autocannon, which gets you 2 strength 5 shots at 12 inches and also 3 strength 7 minus 1 AP 2 damage shots from the autocannon. But then 1 in 3 can take either a high las rotary cannon or an ion beamer. The rotary cannon, like we saw earlier, is 6 shots at strength 6 minus 1 AP 1 damage with sustained hits 1, whilst the ion beamer is 3 shots. It does have sustained hits D3, so it can really spike and get you a load of hits if you are lucky, and then it is strength 7 minus 2 AP and just 1 damage. So there's no super high damage anti-tank style attacks, but for mowing down 1 wound infantry, these guys can actually do quite a lot of work. They also bring a nice selection of war gear items in the comms array, the pan-spectral scanner, and the roll bar searchlight. It's kind of like the Hearthkyn warriors, gets you some command point regen and also ignores cover. The big difference, of course, is the roll bar, which is unique to this unit. It lets you get around the stealth keyword, giving you +1 to hit against units with stealth. So just helping you to negate the downside of those enemy units that have that level of defense. I think for just 30 points each, they are a very fast, fairly durable, and have a decent bit of output in terms of anti-infantry firepower. So I do think the Votann will appreciate this unit, and it will really help your otherwise somewhat slow army sometimes get around the board much more reliably and go and grab far off objectives much more easily. So I do think they have a lot of use in a Votann list, even just a couple of min-sized units. Now the Thunderkyn, as we mentioned earlier, they are something of a devastator squad for the Votann. They come with a base toughness of 6, which is pretty solid. They've got 3 wounds and they've got a 3-up save, so they can stick around a good long while to unleash their firepower into your opponent. They come in either a squad of 3 or 6 for either 85 or 170 points, so they are just over 28 points per model, and they get a somewhat cheeky but not super amazing rule of Oathband covering fire. And what this does essentially is let them overwatch on 5s. It's nice, and with a full unit of these, Overwatch can be quite scary hitting on 5s, but it's one of those abilities that will be nice when you get to use it, but it won't always come up. In terms of where that output comes from though, that is in the form of their ranged weapons, and they come base with bolt cannons, but they can be swapped out for either a graviton blast cannon or a conversion beamer. They all have to have the same weapon, so you can't mix and match, but the bolt cannons, they are strength 6, -1 AP and 2 damage with 3 shots each and sustained hits 1, so they are essentially better heavy bolters and do some good anti-marine work, as well as being really great into toughness 3 enemies because they will now be wounding on 2s. The Graviton Blast Cannon is instead your anti-vehicle option. It wounds vehicles on 2s, which is just fantastic, and they can also double up as being okay anti-horde because they are D6 shots and they have blast, so they can thin out those bigger squads of gaunts or guardsmen quite well on top of their anti-vehicle kind of main focus. And then they can even take out marines reasonably well because on top of the D6 shots, they are also 2 damage and -2 AP. So these are quite a good generalist gun. They are mainly focused at taking out vehicles and being good into vehicles, but they can shoot into pretty much anything and do reasonably well into them. The final option is the conversion beamers. These are only 1 shot and they hit on 4s, and they are strength 7, -1 AP and a flat 3 damage, which is quite a good profile, but they do also get sustained hits D3, so they can potentially get 4 hits each, which can, with that flat 3 damage, make them very scary into things like Terminators or Custodes. But where they get a big boost to their output is the conversion rule, and what this does is it gives them critical hits on a 4+ when the target is over 12 inches away. So with their 24-inch range, they really can reach out and get a load of hits with those D3 sustained proccing on 4s rather than the usual 6s. So it does give them a lot of potential. They can still be quite swingy, but a full unit of 6 can potentially throw down 24 hits in total. And even on completely average rolling, they would kill off around 2 Terminators, even more if the target has any judgment tokens on them. So they can do a good bit of work just sitting back, holding a backfield objective, and just thinning down things like Custodes or Terminators as the game goes on. We now move on to the Votann vehicles, and starting things off is the Sagitaur, which is the Rhino equivalent transport for the leagues. It's 115 points with a 12-inch move, toughness 10, 9 wounds and a 3-up save, so it's fairly standard. It does get a 6-inch scout move though, which is great for getting you up the board that bit further and bringing a unit of Hearthkyn warriors with it. The big thing about this is that it only has a transport capacity of 6, which may sound like it would be a problem for the warrior squads which only come in a unit of 10. But this is where the unique rule it has comes into play, where it allows you to split a unit of Hearthkyn warriors in half, and you can put one half in the Sagitaur, and then the other half can either be in another Sagitaur or just start on the board doing their own thing. So you can get 5 warriors and a Kâhl in this, and then maybe leave the other 5 warriors with the 2 heavy weapons to hold a backfield objective whilst your unit in the Sagitaur moves up the board. So it can be really quite flexible, and the unit that is in it can also disembark from it after the Sagitaur has advanced. They can't declare a charge or anything, but it does get you a load of mobility out of a unit of warriors. You get a 6-inch scout move, you get a 12-inch move and D6 advance, so you can get well into the midfield of the board in turn 1, and then you can still disembark and do a bit of shooting or steal an objective from your opponent. In terms of its own output, it's kind of like a Razorback. The Sagitaur comes with a high las beam cannon and a twin bolt cannon. The bolt cannon is a 36-inch range with 3 shots at strength 6 -1 AP and 2 damage, and it has sustained hits 1 and twin linked, so it's quite reliable anti-marine firepower. And then the beam cannon, that again, like we saw earlier, gets you the sustained hits D3, but this time it is 2 shots at strength 12 -3 AP and D6 damage, so it's actually a reliably good bit of anti-tank. If instead you want to swap that out, you can do. You can swap it out for an autocannon for 6 shots at strength 7 -1 AP and 2 damage, or my favourite, which is a combined profile of the L7 missile launcher and Sagitaur missile launcher. This option gets you 1 strength 9 -2 AP D6 damage shot from the L7, and then 2 strength 12 -3 AP 3 damage shots from the Sagitaur launcher, which to me just feels a bit more reliable. It does also on top of that give you the option of the D6 shot blast profile from the L7, so if you need a bit of anti-tank as well as having some more anti-infantry firepower, that would be my pick out of the 3. But to be honest, all of them are fairly solid, and it is just a really fantastic vehicle for bringing you some much needed mobility to the army, as well as some good fire support in terms of its own weaponry. The massive land fortress is a chunkier 225 points, but it nets you a very tanky toughness 12 16 wound vehicle with a 2-up save that also has a fantastic array of weapons and which can also ignore cover with the pan-spectral scanner, which boosts your ranged attacks. In terms of what it comes with, it has a cyclic ion cannon, a matter autocannon, and 2 twin bolt cannons, and it can take 12 infantry models, or 6 exo armor, or 4 exo frame models. So it does have some acceptable transport capacity. It's kind of like a Votann mini Land Raider or Repulsor. And then it provides some support to those units as well with the fire support rule. And what that means is that after it's shot, you can pick a unit that this vehicle has hit, and a unit that has disembarked from your land fortress that turn gets to reroll their wound rolls against that target. So it makes things like a unit of disembarked Thunderkyn even more terrifying if they get out of your land fortress and just unleash hell into an enemy unit that your land fortress is shot at. And it's no slouch in terms of its own shooting too. The ion cannon gives you d6 plus 3, strength 9, minus 2 AP, 2 damage shots to help kill off marines, whilst the matter autocannon brings you 6 strength 7 shots that are minus 1 AP and 2 damage, so it's still a decent bit of volume fire. And then the ion cannon can be swapped out for either a heavy conversion beamer, much like the Thunderkyn version, just with a boosted strength 10, minus 2 AP and flat 4 damage profile, and having 2 shots base, which is very, very nice with those sustained hits D3, or you can take the Magna Rail Cannon, which is just an utterly horrendous profile. It's strength 18, minus 4 AP, D6 plus 6 damage, and it has devastating wounds. So even though it's super swingy with just 1 shot, when it does hit, it is going to hurt whatever you target at. If you manage to roll that 6th wound, that is just going to be a flat d6 plus 6 mortal damage into an opponent, and no matter what profile or stat line you have, that is going to take a massive chunk out of them. An average of 9 to 10 damage is exceptionally good, and it could definitely be worth the pick if you are either feeling lucky or you are going up against things like knights or a bit of a Nidzilla style monster heavy army. This could definitely help you take out those big scary monsters and vehicles much more reliably. The final unit for the Votann is the Hernkyn Yaegirs kill team. These guys did go up in the latest field manual to 90 points, but they are a unit of 10, so it is 9 points for a toughness 5 model with 1 wound and a 5-up save. They've got an actually okay 6-inch move for the Votann, and they can also infiltrate too, which really will help you to get them where you need them to be. But what they are is essentially a close range objective grabbing unit. They've got a basic weapon of the bolt shotgun, which is 2 strength 5 shots, and they can also take a couple of medium strength weapons in the APM launcher or the Magna Coil rifle. Now these definitely aren't heavy weapons, but they do get you some slightly more damaging firepower with either d6 damage on the APM launcher or the precision rule on the rifle just to help you snipe out some characters. So they can, as I said, be good objective grabbers and also be quite tricky for your opponent to pin down thanks to their rule Pragmatic Hunters. And this rule allows them to move once per turn if an enemy unit ends a move within 9 inches of them, so they can make a normal move if that happens of up to d6 inches. So it just makes them that bit trickier for your opponent to charge, or you can use it to fall back and hide behind some terrain, or you can even use it to move them up to block an enemy charge or screen a more valuable unit that is at risk of being charged. So they are just all round a decent utility unit. I think they're not super durable or super killy, but they can bring you a cheapish little roadblock to your army right when you need it, and with Infiltrate they can get onto some objectives to help you start scoring points that bit earlier too if you are playing the objective game really strongly. And that is the Votann. As I said at the beginning, they don't have the biggest roster, and I know a lot of people aren't the biggest fans of the Votann in terms of their lore and models, but I think they're quite cool and they're quite fun, and they are certainly, if nothing else, quite a unique army. So I do like them, and I do think they have a lot going for them if you do like their aesthetic and their lore behind them. But as always, what do you make of the Leagues of Votann, and how do you think they are faring in 10th edition? And on top of that, what new units would you like to see GW bring to them when they do get their eventual codex release? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe for more Warhammer content from me, but until next time, I'll catch you later guys.